up for the Golden Bears.
All right, Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports, joins us here on 365 Sports. We've given our thoughts about the Ohio State run, the championship. I mentioned your note about Will Howard, and thanks for your time, by the way. You were in Atlanta, correct?
I was not this time.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Okay, that's right, for the other game. So just overall, your thoughts about the run they made. The Buckeyes, incredibly talented. They win the national title. Ryan Day now has that off his back, no matter about the record against Michigan and the run the Buckeyes made.
Yeah, well, it was a really impressive run. When you talk about 4-game runs in the history of college football, I mean, it's got to be up there. Of course, the first time that we've ever had this 4-round, 12-team playoff. But, I mean, from the beginning of the playoff, it was clear they were the best team in the country. And they demolished Tennessee, of course. They run Oregon out of the building. They have a great game against Texas, and they outlast Notre Dame. I mean, to do this 4 games in a row for anybody is really, really difficult. And I felt like heading into the season, heading into the postseason as well, this was the best roster in the country. They had some really notable retentions after the 2023 season, especially their defensive ends, Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, who both could have been top NFL draft picks. So it was kind of a perfect storm for this team. And I think it's very fitting that they ultimately were able to get it done.
Will Howard's ascendancy here, he got pushed out the door because Kansas State doesn't just find Avery Johnsons all the time. So he gets kind of pushed out the door at Kansas State. He winds up at Ohio State, who pushed a quarterback who lost 1 game out the door. They pair him with Chip Kelly, and it was a perfect match for them. And after, he won the Big 12 title, but then he ran up against the wall against Texas. His hero tale is pretty good, isn't it, Sean?
No question. And I do want to point to that one thing that you mentioned, right? Kyle McCord gets pushed out the door after losing 1 game. So if anybody feels like pressure isn't real at Ohio State, look at what Ohio State did to a quarterback who only lost 1 game. But it really is such a great story. I remember back in 2020, when Will Howard first made his debut at Kansas State, I don't want to exaggerate, but he was one of the worst quarterbacks I'd ever seen in the Big 12. He was not a good football player. He wasn't supposed to play at that point. He was only thrust into starting action because Skylar Thompson got hurt, but he was just inaccurate. He was a bad decision maker. He was not he just wasn't decisive with the football. I think he finished with 8 touchdowns to 11 interceptions and completed 53% of his passes. But you just saw him continue to get better over his career. 2022 was kind of his magnum opus as the Kansas State Wildcats, leading them to a Big 12 title, being super decisive, making great throws, making great reads. And you see him land at Ohio State, and I was a little skeptical of the move when it was made. I just felt like, look, they're so used to having NFL level passing back there. And while I think that Will Howard probably will get his opportunity at the next level, he isn't a CJ Stroud. He isn't a Justin Fields necessarily. I don't even think he's, as a pure passer, a Kyle McCord, but he just gave them everything that they needed from that team. He's just a winning player. He was able to do some stuff with his legs, and I think he just deserves so much credit for the way that he elevated himself. He was not a recruit that many people wanted outside of the state of Kansas, but he did a great job, and now he goes out a champion.
Shehan, how do you think Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame kind of put it back together? I mean, nothing to hang their heads about, obviously. No existential crisis or anything like that losing to this Ohio State team. But what do you feel like they kind of think looking in the mirror after that one last night and now what comes next?
Well, I think that more than anything, they feel like, we were so close. We had our chances. Of course, they drive into within the 10-yard line, have a chance to potentially pull it within 1 score and fail to do so. So, I think that they're going to be thinking for a while about these missed opportunities, but if I'm Notre Dame, if I'm a Notre Dame fan, if I'm a member of that roster, I am so excited because this kind of wasn't supposed to be the year yet. This was a little bit of a transition year. If you look at the state of their roster, they replaced most of their offensive line. They lost a couple of key guys last year. And in 2025, the vast majority of this roster is returning. Now, quarterback Riley Leonard is gone, of course. Defensive back Xavier Watts. And, so you have to replace a couple of pieces. But so many guys have gotten the opportunity to play, 1, because of how long the season was, but 2, because of the injuries that they've suffered as well. So I think specifically about their offensive line in 2025, they're going to have 6 or 7 guys who could start at most places in the country. I mean, you saw Charles Jagus came off the bench after suffering what appeared to be a season-ending injury before the season, plays really well at left tackle. Well, Anthony Knapp was a freshman All-American at left tackle, and Emil Wagner is a player that they're really excited about at right tackle. Jeremiah Love will be back for them at running back. Jaden Greathouse will be back for them at wide receiver. Really, the only question that you have to have about this team in 2025 is quarterback. And I think both Steve Angeli and CJ Carr have a lot more upside than what Riley Leonard gave you as a passer. So I'd be very excited right now if I'm a Notre Dame fan. And I think that Marcus Freeman is just really becoming one of the faces of college football.
Okay, so we've had our first ever 12-team playoff. And as you know, I mean, there's this like angst and there's always, oh my God, immediately Indiana gets blown out. In the end, I enjoyed the hell out of it. There were some games that got opened up, and that was not even the close game last night at times. I loved it. What about you?
Well, I think that one thing that people have pointed to across this playoff is, well, you know, the regular season meant a little bit less because, look, the game, you know, that would have been a debilitating loss for Ohio State. They come back winning the national championship. But what I think people miss in conversations like that is that 125 other teams had more meaningful seasons in 2025. Boise State had a more meaningful season than they would have had than if they had just won the Mountain West. Arizona State had a more meaningful season than they would have had. And so, one, I think that you look at its impact across the regular season, it was immense. I've said it over and over again. I've had more people ask me about UNLV football or Iowa State than I've ever had in my entire life. The other piece of this, too, though, is you look at the actual products on the field. Yeah, the first round was filled with blowouts. It's football, not even college football. It's football. Sometimes blowouts happen. It's just part of the game. But you look at that quarterfinal round, there were a couple of really great games, including Texas versus Arizona State going to double overtime. You look at the semifinal round, both games were like all-timer types with Penn State versus Notre Dame, and then, of course, Ohio State versus Texas. And then the national title game, the score is 31-7, but Notre Dame comes all the way back, gives themselves a chance at the end of the game, and just isn't able to get it done. But like a really competitive game overall. We got some great football. We got kind of some outcomes that we didn't necessarily expect. I mean, very few people picked Ohio State over Notre Dame heading into the college football playoff. You know, it was definitely possible. Nobody's shocked that Ohio State was good enough to win, but this was as open a year as I think we've had in a while, and I think the format has a lot to do with that. So I love the format. I'm really excited to see how it continues to grow heading forward, and I think that we're in good hands with this 12-team field.
What do you think about the next year? I mean, you're going to have to write it way too early, top 25, and all those things that you got to do to fill up the content sheet and all that. But do you look at this offseason as pretty much a clean slate, as much as it ever will be now because of the way college football works?
Well, I wrote an article earlier today where I just tried to handicap who's going to be number 1 in the preseason top 25, but not even getting into the rest of the top 25. And it's a lot harder than you'd expect. I kind of made the case for Notre Dame right there. I think that they're going to be right there with anybody. Certainly Texas with Arch Manning coming in. But if you look at specifically Dennis Dodd's preseason top 25, the way too early ranking that he just put out, 6 of the top 7 projected teams are replacing a quarterback. And it reminds me so much of that 2021 season where you have Trevor Lawrence and you have Mac Jones and you have just all these guys graduating out at the same time, Justin Fields being the other big one. And it opened the door. It opened the door for Stetson Bennett in Georgia to come through. I think that 2025 could look a lot like that as well, where you just have so much turnover between the real sort of superpowers in college football. I mean, Ohio State, when you think about the amount of guys who are going to lose, it's going to be hard to go back to back. I think that when you look at a team like Georgia, they're losing so many of their top pieces. Texas is losing a number of their top pieces. I do think this is going to be as open a year as we've ever had in 2025. And the other piece of this too is I think that it changes the way dramatically that we think about the field and the sport, the fact that we have this 12-team field. I mean, in 2024, if we only have the 4-team playoff, Notre Dame and Ohio State aren't even in the field. I think that that's going to be a huge shaper of how we talk about and have conversations about these teams heading into 2025.
Shehan, the Big Ten riding a pretty fun little 2-year run right here. Do you feel like this is kind of the status quo moving forward? I was mentioning a little while ago, like everything suits them now. Everything favors them and the SEC, but maybe even the Big Ten in some cases more because of their alumni bases and things like that. But are you one buying into the narrative about the shifting of the guard and the dominance of college football? Do you think it's wide open? Just kind of how do you feel about that particular storyline that we've seen creeping up, especially here towards the end of this playoff?
Well, the last time that the Big Ten won back-to-back national championships was 1965. And the last time that you had back-to-back AP national championships specifically was 1942. So, like, this doesn't happen where you have these teams go and do it. And, I mean, look, even Michigan last year, right? Michigan hadn't won one in the BCS or CFP eras. Ohio State had only won one total in the BCS and CFP, or in the CFP era, and then only won one in the BCS era before that. So, like, it's been pretty rare that we've had Big Ten teams consistently competing at this level. And you could even throw in Penn State getting into the Final Four as well and having a chance to play for a national championship. So I do think that there is a little bit of a shift in play, and I think there's a couple of reasons for it. One, historically being the last 20, 25 years or so, recruiting has been such a local game. It's based on proximity. It's based on finding guys who are close to your campus. And yes, there's some greasing the wheels under the table, but like that's the biggest driver of everything. Well, now when we're in a true pay-for-play type environment, I mean, look at some of the schools in the Big Ten and the amount of money that they have access to, both in terms of alumni and also in terms of metros. Like, all of a sudden, yes, you have the Ohio States and the Michigans. I think everybody knows about those, but you have the Oregons jump into the mix. You have the USCs, the Washingtons. I think you even have the Iowas and the Wisconsins in a unique kind of way. And historically, like, SEC teams have been a lot looser with being willing to play under the table with money. If suddenly everything's out in the open and it's a pure money game, I think that does actually give a lot of benefit to Northern teams and Western teams in a way that we haven't seen. So, look, I don't think that the SEC is going to be shut out of the next 10 national championships by any means, but I do think that we are seeing a restructuring that is going to change the way that we look at things. And I think that the SEC's run of dominance is probably coming to an end.
Shehan, I saw the top 25, the AP. Obviously, the national champion is Ohio State. They win the game, like when they had even the BCS or whatever. But I did notice it, man, there's a lot of infiltration this year inside the final AP top 25. Group of 5 schools, a lot of them. Finally, Arizona State got some attention at number 7, etc. Do you feel like this year, well, everyone may say, oh, it does look like there's a change, a little bit of a change, but then go right back to what everyone always thinks when we get to August?
Well, I think that what's going to be most interesting, right, is like you talk about this run of dominance in the SEC. It's coincided with Nick Saban and Urban Meyer and Steve Spurrier, and like none of those guys are here anymore. You've still got Kirby Smart, who's an all-time great, absolutely, but like, Steve Sarkisian is still somebody who's never won a national championship. You look at the 3 coaches who have won national championships. Only one of them is now in the SEC, one Dubas winning in the ACC, and now Ryan Day in the Big Ten. So, like, I think that as the years go on, you're going to see a little bit of a lessening of that implicit kind of credibility that existed when Nick Saban was a member of the Southeastern Conference. In fact, I think that Alabama might be the most interesting of these guys to kind of look at, especially when you look into 2025. I'm fascinated to see where they're ranked and rated after a pretty disappointing 9-4 season for Kalen DeBoer. But I do think that you are starting to see, and this is, I think, also a consequence of the 12-team playoff, you're starting to see more teams enter the conversation, enter the lexicon, enter people's kind of consciousness. And I don't think that that's something that's going to slow down. Like, we're going to think about UNLV a little bit more because of what they achieved in the Mountain West and the fact that they gave themselves a chance to be in the college football playoff. We're going to think about Arizona State just a little bit more. We're going to think about BYU and Utah and all these teams that have gotten into the conversation. So I do think that this is only the beginning of a long-term shift. Now, look, the SEC and Big Ten, resource-wise, like, they're going to be able to do some stuff that the other conferences just aren't able to do. But I do think that as we have more teams involved in this conversation, it's going to impact the way that people see them. And I always say, perception drives reality in college football more than maybe any other sport in the world.
Do you think that we're set up for a Donnybrook over the CFP and the money and all these different things and the seeding over the next couple years?
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
Fight between the conferences.
No, I do think that we will. And, it's so fascinating, right? You heard whenever we entered this new structure that Brett Yormark, one of the big things that he said was like, we want a look-in after, 2027, 2028, whenever it is, because we are given a smaller amount of the pie right now, and we think that can and should change later. So I do think that we are going to have more of these fights and more of these conversations. I mean, this year, right, like the conversation has been so much, the Big Ten wants to guarantee 4 teams because they're not sure they can get one. Well, it was the SEC who didn't get 4 teams like they expected. And instead, the Big Ten was the one that not only had 4 teams in, but also produced the national champion. So I do think that we are going to see a little bit more of a fight. And I think also to some of the teams that changed conferences, Oklahoma being one among them, USC being among them, Washington, like some of these schools are trying to set themselves up long term. And if they don't have success on the field, I think there might be even more frantic energy to try to pull more and more money. So I think we're only getting started with this, but I am hopeful that especially with kind of the advent of this 12-team playoff, that power gets to be distributed just a little bit differently.
Jaden Greathouse. My goodness, he a Stars born, right? Because of what he did in that game when they came back to beat Penn State. He was fantastic last night. Texas people know him for he was a great player at Westlake with Klubnik, but you brought that up, and it was good to see what a great catch for the touchdown that he kind of all of a sudden had the eyes of the country that may not have really known much about him, but now they do.
No, and this is one of the greatest parts, in my opinion, about the 12-team playoff is that usually the idea of like a program legend or like a star in college football, it was reserved to the team that probably won the national championship. But you have some of these guys popping up, and just to refer to a few, right? Like Cam Scadaboo is going to be a player that we talk about for a long time, even though his team didn't even win a college football playoff game. But I think that Jaden Greathouse, along with Jeremiah Smith of Ohio State, probably the biggest breakout star of these past couple of games. I mean, 233 yards and 3 touchdowns in the last 2 matchups alone. Like you said, the game-changing play against Penn State to put Notre Dame in the national championship. Really, like when you talk about modern era, that's up there with the most important plays in the history of the program. And then he almost carries them all the way back in that fourth quarter. So definitely a breakout star. And the other piece, too, is when you talk about Notre Dame and when you talk about Jaden Greathouse, I think that if you're Marcus Freeman and if you're Mike Denbrock, their offensive coordinator, it has to change the way that you think about structuring your offense. Because this year, of course, there's such a run-based offense and a quarterback run-based offense. You've got some receivers out there, Jaden Greathouse chief among them, who are big-time players. And I think that whether it is Steve Angeli or whether it's CJ Carr who ultimately starts for them, you've got to involve them a little bit more in your game plan, and you need to continue to develop that passing game because Jaden Greathouse is a star. I said it when he committed to Notre Dame coming out of high school and when he enrolled in 2022, I believe, he is the type of player that Notre Dame was not getting under Brian Kelly. Marcus Freeman got him. Marcus Freeman has retained him. Now I think that it's time for Marcus Freeman to deploy him at an even higher level.
I thank you very much, Shehan. It's been great to have you on. And when college football stories happen throughout the next few months, hopefully we can get you on. But I did like what you had. You said something about the winners of the 12-team playoffs. To me, college football, the game, the fans, etc. But you also mentioned, other than a lot of the teams that made it, you included UNLV and South Carolina, because it allowed them to be known, right? It allowed people to know, like you said, that asked you about UNLV, asked you about Iowa State, that otherwise would never have asked you about any of them.
No, there's no question about it. I mean, South Carolina fans are going to look and wonder what could have been and think, like, we should have been in. But, like, in the 4-team playoff, we don't talk about that team any differently than we do about, like, Syracuse, right? Like they're a team that would have just had a nice season and we'd say, congrats on your 9-3, now move on. But like they were legitimate college football playoff contenders because of this new system and because of the way they finished the year. And so I think that if you are a program that's a little bit less of a have, even in one of the two big conferences, this is a game changer for you. It gives you the opportunity to play your way up. It gives Indiana the chance to play your way up. It gives SMU the chance to play their way up. And again, even if you aren't a team that make it in, like you mentioned, to be in that conversation and to be in the center of the national spotlight, even if it is because you got left out, it's just a game-changing sort of thing. And not only will it impact South Carolina and the way that they think about this 2024 team, but when we look into 2025 and we start putting out our way too early rankings, people are going to look at South Carolina a little bit closer because of how they finished and because they were so close.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports, been with us almost every Tuesday for the last several weeks on college football, and the season ended last night. And